नहमदुहु व नुसल्ली अला रसूलिहिल करीम अम्मा बाद फ़अऊज़ु बिल्लाहि मिनश शैतानिर रजीम बिस्मिल्लाहिर रहमानिर रहीम अस्सलामु अलैकुम व रहमतुल्लाहि व बरकातुहू. This is the third lecture in our series of lecture about the life of the Holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. As you can understand, we were trying to create a context in the last lecture around the Prophet's life prior to the coming of Islam and how the society lived. It's important to create a baseline from where we can begin. So in order to understand the change that the Holy Prophet brought into Arabia and then in the rest of the world, we want to create the outline of society on how it existed. The backbone of this lecture, or the primary source of this lecture, is Ar-Rahiqul Maktoum by Safiyur Rahman Mubarak Puri, but we have taken many quotations and many narrations from different books of tafasir and hadith. So as we were describing the last time, we were going to describe the position of the Quraysh within the society. The Quraysh considered themselves descendants of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam. So they considered themselves superior from a genealogical standpoint and also from a religious standpoint, but they have created many innovations in the faith, or bid'at. They had a great respect for Kaaba, the house of God that was originally built by Ibrahim alayhi salam, and even before that by Adam alayhi salam, and was always there based on what we know from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they also made their tawaf around it. They also performed hajj to it. They also circulated around the Kaaba. But there were many innovations that they had made that corrupted the faith. Let me tell you some of those things. They considered their status to be greater than the rest of the people. And so when they did their hajj and it was time to go to do wuquf Arafat, or to go to Arafat, the Quraysh, which were considered the leaders of the community, never went to Arafat. They continued to stay in Muzdalifah and made their prayer in Muzdalifah, or they continued to stay in Mish'ar al-Haram. This is greatly described in many of the book of tafsir and hadith, that the Quraysh, because they thought they were the elite in society, stayed in Muzdalifah or Mish'ar al-Haram instead of going to Arafat, and then they would push the commoners toward Arafat. And when the Holy Prophet went to perform his hajj, he wanted to show that he was not of the elite, that he was a common man, and from the order of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he actually proceeded and made his qiyam, or his stay, in Arafat. So this was one of the things that they did. And they also believed that during the time of the hajj, or the sacred months, they would not be able to produce or make any dairy products. So they would not make cheese, which was one of their primary diets, and they would also not make butter fat or butter oil from the dairy products. They also believed that they could not stay inside, they would not find shade or rest inside the tent that was made from animal skin. So if a tent was made from animal skin, because it had hair on it, they considered that to be an impermissible act, and it would invalidate their hajj. So they would only rest under a tree or under a permanent structure during the haram months, during the time of hajj. If non-residents, so these are some of the innovations. If non-residents from Mecca came from outside and they brought food with them, when they were in the process of performing hajj, Quraysh also felt that this food was unclean and they couldn't eat any of this food. The Quraysh also felt that when non-residents came to Mecca to perform their hajj, that if they came to Mecca to perform their first tawaf around the Kaaba, the only clothes that they could wear were the clothes that were provided by the Quraysh themselves. And if the clothes were not available for these non-residents to wear, then the men would circulate around the Kaaba naked, and the women would wear one very small shirt so that they would be exposed. So these were some of the bid'at that we see. The other thing is, once these clothes were used up, the clothes that came from outside, and the women performed their tawaf in them. So let's say if a powerful person came and decided to do their tawaf in the clothes they brought from their point of origin, those clothes would then be discarded as being unclean. Another innovation in the faith was that when the Quraysh were in the state of ihram or in the process of hajj, they would not enter their house through the front door. They would only enter their house through a hole in the wall in the back. So none of these are Abrahamic traditions, none of these are traditions of Ismail alayhi salam, but the Quraysh made them up as they went along. So if you look at the background religions in society at the time, we had many other faiths that were in society, and as the hold and grip of the Abrahamic faith became weakened and people started creating all of these innovations, other faiths spread into the area, which were the following. The Zoroastrian religion, which is the fire worshippers or Majusi, these were primarily present in Iran. And if you know that Iran, I mentioned earlier, was the biggest superpower at the time. So the areas of Bahrain, the areas surrounding the Gulf, and the areas surrounding the Persian Empire were full of people who were fire worshippers or Zoroastrians. The Christianity was coming in from the Byzantine Empire of Eastern Europe, also called the Byzantium, and their last outpost, I would say, was in Syria or Sham or Ghassan, which was called at that time. So Syria, its surrounding areas, had some strongholds, Palestine of Christianity, and there were also a few rulers of Iraq, which was called Hira at the time, which were also accepted Christianity. Judaism existed in different parts of Hijaz, in around Mecca and Medina, and there were times when they were dominant. When there's times they were lowered in number, but there were two primary times when the Jewish faith, people of the Jewish faith, immigrated to the area of Medina, and one was in the time of Bakht Nasr. So Bakht Nasr in about 600 BC ascended the throne, inherited it from his father, and invaded the area. So he was from Babylon, or the ancient name Babel, which is the old name of Iraq, and he invaded Syria, he invaded Palestine, and he expelled the Jews from there. A lot of them were killed and taken prisoner. And so there's also a famous story around Bakht Nasr. And if you look it up on the internet, it will come up as a slightly different name, but if you pronounce the CH as a Kha, then you will come to the name Bakht Nasr. That Bakht Nasr had captured the prophet Daniel alayhi salam, Daniel, and he had thrown him in a pit with two lions, and the lions did not hurt Prophet Daniel. At the same time, the prophet Jeremiah was ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and inspired to bring food for Daniel alayhi salam. He prepared the food and came and gave the food to Daniel alayhi salam and told him that he had been ordered by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this tribe was destroyed by Bakht Nasr, the Jewish tribes over there. And then there is also a saying that Uzair alayhi salam, which is in the Jewish version as Ezra, came to this land and found that the tribe was gone, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made him sleep for 100 years and then he woke up. So there's a whole story behind it. I'd like you to look it up and maybe read it a little bit. This is for all my high school students in the youth leadership program, but the rest of the people can also benefit for it. So that was one of the times when a lot of Jewish migration took place to the north of Medina and the areas surrounding Medina. The second time was around 79 to 80 AD, when Titus, the Roman emperor, who was overall considered a decent guy in the books of history, obviously not for the Jewish tribes, there was a rebellion of the Jewish faith against him, and so he crushed the rebellion in Jerusalem, and a lot of the Jews were fled there, and they came and resided in the Medina area of the Medina. So this is kind of the history of how Jews came there. Then there is also a religion called to continue, where did the Jews live? They lived in the time of Yasrib, Khaybar, Taima, and also if you look at the time of the Holy Prophet, they were primarily living in Khaybar, the tribe of Nazir, we call Banu Nazir, and this was basically, it means the children of Nazir, Bani Mustaliq, Bani Qurayza, and Bani Qainqa. And all of these, as we go into the history of the life of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these names are going to come up again and again. And some traditions say there were more than 20 Jewish tribes, but the 5 most dominant are the one I just described. So there's another religion called Sabians. So Sabians are an offshoot of the Abrahamic faith. They believed in Adam, they believed in Noah, they believed in the prophet Enos, they believed in Abel or Habil, and they have a special affiliation with the teachings of Yahya alayhi salam, John the Baptist, who is the maternal cousin of Isa alayhi salam, his mother's sister's husband. If you remember the story of Zachariah alayhi salam, Yahya alayhi salam was the son of Zachariah alayhi salam. He was a maternal cousin of Jesus, Isa alayhi salam. And that whole story is, of course, in Surah Maryam in the Quran. One should read it. But coming back, that Sabians who revered John the Baptist also existed, although the Sabians had intermingled with the Jewish faith, and there were very few of them remaining at the time. So Yemen was first occupied by Christianity in the year 340 AD, and then they continued to thrive there till the year 378. And there was a famous preacher in Yemen. His name was Fenian. We see his name come up in history a lot. He came to Najran. The people of Najran believed in him as a man of God, and so Christianity was spread in Najran extensively. Zu-Nawas, who was a king of Najran, inherited the kingdom from his father, persecuted the Christianity in Najran extensively, forced the people to convert to Judaism. This is all history. And people pretty much refused to give up their faith. So he dug up a large trench, and 20,000 to 40,000 people, men, women, children, babies, toddlers, very old people, were all thrown into a pit of burning fire. And this is described in Surah Buruj in the Quran, right? Ashab al-Ukhdud, Qutula Ashab al-Ukhdud. So this is the people who burned in the ditch. This is some of the history, and how the Judaism took stronghold in Najran and Yemen. So Najran is basically a province on the southwest of Saudi Arabia at the border of Yemen. So then what happened was Ethiopians, who were also a superpower at the time, only second to Persia, decided that they did not want the persecution of the followers of Jesus Christ or Christians in Yemen, and so Ethiopia sent a very large fleet under Ariyat to Yemen. They conquered Yemen, they put an end to the Jewish rule there, and so Christian rule was ever established. And so a junior officer in the army of Ariyat, which is called Abraha, there's different traditions around it, Abraha eventually came to power, and then he built a church in Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and he called it Al-Qulais. And then he decided that he would divert the pilgrimage from Mecca to this church, Ecclesia Church he called it. And so that's how he decided to raid Mecca with 60,000 troops and 9 elephants. And that's a famous story which is described in Surah Fil, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave him or handed him a punishment that is a lesson for humanity for the rest of time. And so we all know that story. So coming back to our lecture, there was Roman influence, like we said, in Ghassan in Syria. There was some Roman influence in Iraq. There were 5 main Jewish tribes in Medina. There was the fire worshippers that were from Iran and around Bahrain and Khalij, and there were the Sabian or Sabbi religion, or Subba is the plural in that area as well. So even though the Quraysh claim to be the children of Ibrahim alayhi salam and Ismail alayhi salam, many nonsensical traditions or innovations in the faith, bid'at, had gotten into them. They knew that these were innovations, but they called them bid'at hasana, good innovations in their faith. And these innovations not only influenced their religious life, but it also influenced their political life. It also influenced the society as a whole, and it's also developed into bad traditions for the community and socially and economically. So considering the Jewish tribes, the rabbis were very, very strong in the Jewish tribes. They commanded a lot of authority, but this is unlike the true teachings of the Jewish faith. They had become very, very rich. and so a lot of them were corrupted, and they wanted the utmost power and influence, and so they grew the personal influence around Medina at the expense of the practices of the faith. And so as a whole, so if you look at Christianity, Christianity was also caught up in Trinity. If you see this intermingling of God and human form, God comes to humans in human form to tell them how to live, and Jesus was considered a personification of God on this earth. So this is definitely counter to our Islamic belief. We say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is free from fault, so he would not be the right example for human beings. Only a human being with all the fault and failings, the difficulties, the desire to eat, the desire to marry, the desire to use, all the fault and failing of the human body. Only that type of person can exemplify a good life for human beings, because God is faultless. Now, this is kind of the way we believe it. So the culture, what I'm trying to say is the Jewish tribes, the Christian tribes, and the Quraysh, who were followers of Ibrahim and Ismail alayhi salam, their way of life was similar. It was not identical, but it was similar, because their way of life, this kind of idol worshipping and warmongering and tribalism, was the theme in which they lived. The culture of society was so similar that they kind of, even though they were separate, they lived within a similar lifestyle, because all of them had essentially separated from the true teachings of their faiths. The Quraysh from the Abrahamic teachings, the Jews from the teachings of Musa alayhi salam, and the Christians from the teachings of Isa alayhi salam. So I want to describe the status of women, because I think that's an important aspect of how Islam built society. So in the society, there were the bourgeois, the people in command and control, the rich people, people with authority, and then there were the proletariat, right? In the bourgeois people, the women commanded a lot of control there. So the rich people, the influential people of society, women commanded a lot of control. Even though the head of the household was a man, but women were held in a position of authority and power. At the word of if the women had a complaint against a group of people from a different tribe, swords would get unsheathed, wars would be fought, and then the patching up would also take place if the woman forgave or was able to forgive whatever crime was committed. But the situation of the condition of women was the exact opposite in the masses. As you might know, the masses constitute 80-90% of the society. Their situation was quite different. Women were not held in high honor and regard. They were not respected. The status of a mother, the status of a sister, the status of a wife was not what Islam was going to give it in the future. Rather, it was low. Women were treated as a commodity. They were bought and sold. There was a lot of sexual exploitation of the slave women and slave girls. And so this caused a lot of difficulty in society morally, right? And so zina, which is basically extramarital sex, kind of became very, very common. In the elite of the society, the nikah, the process of marriage, was the same as it is followed today in Islam. Somebody would have an affinity for a person, a female, or a female for a male. The elders would get together. They would decide on the marriage, and then they would give the woman's hand away in marriage to the man and his family. But the one thing still remained, that the woman could not enter into a marriage on her own. So she was not independent in that way, even in the elite of society. There's a quotation from Aisha Raziallah that describes 4 types of nikah that existed in society among the masses. So we talked about the elite, now we'll talk about the masses. The first is the same process that we use in Islam that I just described for the elite. And the other 3 are very distorted. In fact, it's rather uncomfortable even to mention these, and some of these practices were very bizarre, and all of them were rejected by Islam and negated, and only the one process of nikah was maintained, which was the honorable, good, respectful way of preserving chastity and maintaining good moral values. So the second form of nikah was that a husband would initiate to his wife to go and be with a different man. This could be a married man, this could be an unmarried man, and then the husband would separate, and after this woman would get pregnant, then the husband would come back to his wife, and then the child that would be born as a child of that woman, but from a different man. And this was done so the progeny, so the offspring, the child born would be good, would be a good warrior, would be an obedient child. So this is one of the bizarre things that happened. A third form of nikah. So we described the ma'ruf form of nikah, which was in the elite and the commoners. We described the second form of nikah. This is from a tradition from Aisha radiallahu anha. And the third form of nikah was that a woman would invite several men, let's say less than 10, and then she would be with all of them, and then eventually she would get pregnant, and when the child would be born, the child would be delivered, she would invite all of these men. It would be a number from, let's say, 2 to 10, and then she would assign one of them to the father of this child. She would say, you are the father. Of course, there was really no way of knowing with the absence of DNA technology and so forth, but all of them would have to come. They were obligated by the norms of society to come. Nobody could refuse, and whoever was assigned the task of fatherhood would then be the father of their child without knowledge on who the child's father was, and then would take kind of guardianship of this child. And the fourth process was that there was no limit. And this was from women of ill repute, that several men would come, the woman would get pregnant, and then they would call a fortune teller to decide who the father is. So Islam had then come and negated all of these practices. So women were also enslaved much due to military occupation. So a tribe would raid another tribe, and when they would raid the tribe, they would kill the men and they would take the women as slaves, and then these women who were taken as slaves were used for menial tasks, including the performance of vices. And if children were born to these women, these children would have a low ranking order in society for the rest of their life. So if you look at the animal kingdom, this is how the wild dogs, this is how the wolf packs, this is how the monkeys live in this day. If you explore wildlife, there is an alpha male, and then there is an alpha female, and then there's a beta female, and then there's all these low-ranking females in animal world. And so the children that are born to these low-ranking females, even though they are children of the alpha male, have lower ranking in that society. This is basically animal kingdom that we're talking about, and not civilized human society. So this is how low society was. So in order to understand the change and the positivity and I would say, moral revolution brought by Islam, it's important to outline the baseline where we started off. People would have multiple wives. It was very common to marry 2 sisters by one man. Also, after the death of a father, the stepmother would become I would say the property or in the ownership of the son, of the eldest son. And he could either do nikah with her, or he could just keep her in his house as a slave and an object to be used and abused. So this is unfortunately how it used to be. The right to divorce only rested with the man. The woman had no right to divorce. So Islam gave this very important right of a woman to be able to divorce from a man if things were not going in the direction she wanted it to go. So sex and fornication and this sex outside the bounds of marriage, and so immorality became rampant and common. However, we must also state that there were good men and women in society. There were the hunafa, there were people who were good people of upright character, who stayed away, who had a disdain for this lifestyle, who had good moral upbringing and good values and an innate sense of justice and morality which guided their behavior. And we see from history that there were several such people around as well. So, I know there's also a tradition that Arabs would kill most of their children, and we don't find this to be common, but we do find that sometimes if parents feared poverty for their children, parents feared oppressive circumstances, if a child was born to a slave and they feared that the child would grow up in oppression and poverty and abuse, they would bury that child at birth to avoid the injustice that society was going to deliver to this child over the course of their life. At the same time, blood relation and blood relatives were very, very superior. So brotherhood was very important. So tribalism, the base of tribalism was brotherhood, right? Men who were brothers to each other, step brothers to each other, and cousin brothers to each other, brothers from the father's side. So fathers, brothers, children, as sons, were considered a tribe and a brotherhood, and they banded together. They stayed together, they fought together, they aligned together, unified together, and they raided other tribes together. But also, as these wars grew and tribalism prospered, people also found peace treaties and alliances so that they wouldn't have to fight their neighbors all of the time, and they would come to peace, and they would have peace passage when they would go on trade routes or when they would travel. So there is a saying in Arabia that help your brother where he is an oppressor or where he is the oppressed. So it doesn't matter, regardless of whether your brother is doing the right thing or the wrong thing, your job is to support your brother. Islam came and changed the context of this teaching. Islam said, if your brother is oppressed, then help your brother in getting out of the oppression and fighting the oppression. But if your brother is the oppressor, you show him the good path, you show him the right way, you show him the light, you bring him around and help him understand that this behavior is not good, that injustice is going to only invoke Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wrath. And to avoid Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's wrath and to invoke His mercy, we need to be merciful and kind to our human beings on earth. So the economic conditions, let's talk a little bit, next point is about economic conditions, were very, very similar to model conditions. There was really not a lot of trade and economy because of the fear of travel, because the fear of attack from antagonist tribes, from the fear of being robbed and looted and persecuted by enemies or people who you're not allied with. So all of the trade and commerce and business, most of it took place during the haram months, right? During the month of Hajj or Umrah. And during these times, all the main markets were set up, like the fair of Ukkaz, the fair of Zilmajaz, and all of the main trades. These big fairs, these few months of respite where peace was established, they were called haram months because they were pure, they were clean, it was impermissible to kill. So this is where most of the business took place. There was no true manufacturing in Arabia. There was a little bit of tanning industry which existed a little bit in Iraq, a little bit in the outskirts of Syria. But other than leather tanning, there was really not much manufacturing. There was some weaving of the cloth. All of the Arab women spun yarn, took cotton and spun yarn and made thread to make garments, which was then sold to merchants. But this home industry, this cottage industry of women spinning thread to make yarn, we have some narrations from our Holy Prophet's daughter Fatima Raziallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala shower His mercy and blessings on her, that she would also spin yarn or thread, and Ali Raziallah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with him, would go and sell this thread in the market. But there was really no, there was some agrarian economy, especially around Medina where it rains a little bit more, and people would cultivate crops and so forth, primarily date and date palms. So a lot of their diet depended on dates, whether they were fresh or whether they were dry. And they would also allow their animals to eat the seeds of these dates, especially camels who have good digestive systems and can digest almost anything. So cattle rearing, so growing date palms for food and sustenance, and raising cattle and rearing goat, sheep, lamb, camels was the primary means of living, and people would live off the milk, eat their meat, and use their hide for making tents and clothing and so forth. It was the cottage industry. So there was rampant poverty with the absence of rainfall and an active agrarian economy, and not much trade because of fear of travel and tribal wars and highway robbery. There was really not much economy. Poverty was rampant. Many of the average people did not have enough food for 3 times a day or twice a day. They were more like hunters and gatherers, and many didn't have clothing or shelter to support themselves. So we do ask ourselves this question, that why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send all of the holy prophets in this Arab, Jordan, Palestine Syria region, in Iraq region? Why did Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, between Egypt and Syria, why did all these prophets come here? Because Arabia was in the middle of the ancient world. It had land routes and sea routes going into Europe, in Africa, and into Asia, and into the Far East, which was the known world at the time. But also because the Arabs had some unusually good characteristics, even with all their jahiliyyah, even with all their ignorance, they had some unusual characteristics which made them very good people to send a messenger to, because if you could take these very bad people, morally corrupt and depraved people, and if you could turn them around, they would become staunch allies, and they would be very, very good leaders, followers, would establish a faith in the rest of the world. So what were some of these qualities? So some of these, one of the first quality is generosity. And I think in the entire Muslim world, this generosity still, I live in the United States, and people tell me all the time, my friends, that, oh, I know a Muslim brother, and Muslims are the most food generous people in the world. And I would say that that's actually true. If a Muslim brother or sister even had a half a meal, they would gladly give it to somebody who didn't have a meal, even to a non-Muslim, rather than fill their own stomach. So this ability to be extremely generous with the little that they have made them very, very good stewards of society. They took care of each other. There's many stories that a guest came to the house of a man who only had one camel. They would milk the camel to sustain themselves, and there was nothing to eat, and the camel didn't produce milk. So they slaughtered the animal and to serve the meat to the guest, because they wanted to make sure that they were generous and they gave their guest enough sustenance and fruit to stay with them. And so the grapevine, or the shrub of the grape, which sometimes grows and sometimes climbs, this shrub or vine of the grape they used to call karam, or generosity. And the alcohol or wine made from the grape was called bintul karam, or daughter of generosity. Because when you drank alcohol, you became more generous. You lost your inhibitions, and so that they associated karam and bintul karam, the generosity, with their alcohol drinking. A little deviation from how it should be. You should be able to give within your sensibilities. And I quote you a hadith from one of the famous Sahabas, that he said, I found two most generous women in the world, and one was Aisha bint Abi Bakr, and one was her older sister. So just wanted to throw that in there, that generosity is one of the salient features of Islam, and the Arabs were extremely generous. There was also gambling. But what people would do is they would drink, they would lose their inhibitions, they would gamble, and they would lose their wealth. But whoever won the gamble would then take the money, and then they would distribute it to the poor. And Quran admits that there is beneficence to both alcohol and gambling, but Quran says about it, وَإِسْمَهُمَا أَكْبَرُ مِنْ نَفْعَهُمَا, that their sin is greater than their benefit or their profit. So there is some benefit to wine from grape. There is also some benefit to gambling, but it is far the bad qualities and the sin far exceeds the benefit that you derive from these two things. The second quality that the Arabs had, that they would live and die by their word. They would keep their oath. So if they made a promise, an allegiance to somebody, or something that they would do, they would keep their word to the end. They would do that at the destruction of their children. They would do that at the destruction of their homes. They would do that to a point at the destruction of their community. They would be true and honorable to their word. Their word was their writing. If they gave their word and they shook hands on a deal. And this also then goes on to another feature, to say if they made a commitment to do something, which is separate from taking a word or pledge of allegiance to somebody, if they decided or intended to do something, if they made an intention that they would commit something, it was like a promise to themselves. It was like a pledge of allegiance. It was like an oath. They would do it regardless and at all costs, and nothing would stand in their way. So these were some of the great qualities that the Arabs have. They also had a lot of pride and self-respect, and if they felt that anything negated their pride and self-respect and angered them and humiliated them, they would unsheath their swords and they would fight a war. And they did this to a fault, but also to understand that they were very proud and honorable people, and they held this pride in high regard. No insult would be tolerated against their belief system, their faith system, or against their tribalism. They would hold strong together as a band of brothers to protect their system of beliefs, whatever it was. We know that most of it was contaminated, but whatever it was. So I'm going to wrap up this khutbah, but the last attribute that they had was simplicity. As you know, Arabs primarily ate date, drank the milk of the animals that they herded, lived in tents or in the open desert, and this gave them a lot of strength. They were very hardy. They were not going to go away or be uprooted or be exterminated or eradicated very soon, because they were very hardy people. They were also very simple people. They didn't need a lot to carry on. Just a few dates, just a little bit of milk. They knew how to dug the soil to get water from the desert in the oasis. And so because of their simple nature and their honesty and simple nature and desire to not have much means, these were some of the qualities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala selected to send the last messenger and make them the stewards of the Quran and make them companions of the Holy Prophet to carry this deen forward for the rest of humanity, for the rest of time. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Inshallah, in the next lecture, in our fourth lecture, we'll start talking about the family of the Holy Prophet.